We often say that the hour of death cannot be predicted. When we say this, we imagine this hour would be in the distant future. We never thought we'd be thinking about Stan Lee as a memory. You're watching Laketoria Nights, a show where we talk about movies, TV shows, video games, and everything in between. I'm your host Kevin, joined by Andy and CJ, and today we are paying tribute to Stan Lee.
Excelsior.
True believers.
Okay, well then, let's start with you, CJ. What do you think Stan Lee's most influential work was to you?
I'm going to say X-Men.
Okay, how come?
Because X-Men is a mirror image of the civil rights movement and reflects upon things that we deal with even today in 2018. There's a lot of relatable different comic book characters that you could go with, but for me, X-Men and being an African American and just the difference between humans and mutants and things like that, X-Men is the one that always kind of just stuck with me as one of Stan Lee's works that really just reflects everyday life.
All right. Okay. What about you, Andy?
I won't say it's his work that inspired me the most, but I wanted to give a special mention to Hero Man, which was the anime that he worked on. And the reason I think it's so influential isn't because it was great. It was pretty mediocre, all things considered. But I think the takeaway message is that this is a man who had worked in the comic industry for, how many years up until that point? Probably 70 or something.
Right.
Up until the point when that show came out. And he was willing to go, oh, hey, here's this other form of comics from a different culture. Let's see what we can contribute to it. Let's take a look. Let's check this out. It was, I guess, my takeaway from it was that even when you have, cornered your market and you've been at it for so long, that there's still things that you can do to experiment and change and play around with. And I think that's an important thing to take away.
All right, then. Well, I guess my most the work that influenced me the most was, I bet both of you can already know, was Spider-Man.
That's the other reason I couldn't say it.
I feel like I was Peter Parker at one point in time, and just watching that story, reading those comic books, it's kind of like Stan Lee was speaking to me. I know what it's like. I know what it is to be the underdog, or the person that's always out, and the person that just wants to be the hero and doing right. And even though you are doing right, sometimes you do screw up, or sometimes you do think about yourself, thinking that you're going to do something right. And I guess with Spider-Man, it just, laid out. Seeing Spider-Man's journey and everything that he's gone through, one from being a kid to being an adult. I can't say that I've ever lost a father figure at all like Peter Parker did, but I do know what it's like to, try to be accepted, or trying to do the right thing, or making those sacrifices just to make sure that other people are going along their way. And it's kind of like I feel like out of all the characters, Peter Parker spoke to me the most. Yeah. And it just feels kind of weird that Stan Lee is now gone. And it's funny because I had a couple of people in my roleplay group who talked to me. It's just like, you know what, it's kind of weird that Stan Lee's gone, because of him we have this giant world that we play in. And it feels kind of weird that most of the stuff that you tell stories for are modeled off of his world. And I think that's kind of weird, and I've never would have thought of reading comic books because of your roleplay, but because I've been through, the stuff that you've done, or the stories that you've told, it made me more inclined to read some of the comic books and seeing where the inspiration
generates an interest.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that in that weird way, going, without Stan Lee, there's a lot of stories I wouldn't be writing, and there's a lot of things that I wouldn't see myself as.
He inspired you to inspire others.
Yeah, I guess.
No, I definitely agree with you on the whole Spider-Man take. I didn't want to take Spider-Man from you, so I did go with X-Men. But I feel like everyone growing up at one point in time felt like they were Peter Parker, even Miles Morales. With me choosing X-Men, I love how Stan Lee can take what's going on outside, turn it into a comic, and not and have like a neutral perspective, show you all sides and reasonings and motives for different characters, to where you couldn't pick up a comic and take a side without understanding the other side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you still thought for yourself, but it wasn't a comic that said, this is right, this is wrong. It just showed you that gray area of everything, to where there's no true right and wrong. There's just differences of thinking and a difference in opinion. Like with X-Men, like, yeah, it models the civil rights movement with Professor X being Martin Luther King and Magneto being Malcolm X. And then you have the humans, but they didn't portray them as being like hostile racists as much as being scared and uninformed. So it didn't like paint a villain so much as just a different side. And people can understand how fear can motivate doing quote unquote the wrong thing, but you can't really blame them because, you know, we've all done something that we might want to take back because of fear or circumstance or lack of understanding.
Right. Okay. Well, then, on a lighter note to all this, what would you say your favorite Stan Lee cameo in the Marvel Universe? I guess in the cinematic Marvel Universe, or I guess in anything you could say. We won't just limit it to the movies. But what would you say your favorite Stan Lee cameo is?
My favorite Stan Lee cameo, and I'm pretty upset because it's in a bad movie, was at
Is it Thor Ragnarok?
No.
Oh.
It was in the Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, when he couldn't get into the wedding.
Invitation, sir.
I should be on that list.
Name?
Stan Lee.
Yeah, nice try, buddy.
No,
Nice try.
really.
Oh, and they wouldn't let him in?
Mhm.
Yeah. When Sue Storm and Mr. Fantastic were or Ben Richards. Is it Ben Richards? Reed Richards? Mr. Fantastic. We'll just call him Mr. Fantastic. I've never been a huge Fantastic Four fan.
It is Reed Richards, but yeah, go
When
ahead.
Reed Richards and Sue Storm were getting married, Stan Lee wasn't on the guest list to get in. And he couldn't get in the wedding. He just throwing a whole fuss about it. That's probably my favorite. That's probably my favorite Stan Lee cameo. And I hate that it was in a bad movie because nobody likes that movie. But that's one like glowing part of the movie, Stan Lee.
How about you, Andy?
I think my favorite one, at least as far back as I can remember, is probably just the one straight out of Infinity War.
I need you to cause a distraction.
Holy shit. We're all gonna die! There's a spaceship!
What's the matter with you kids? You never seen a spaceship before?
When all these kids are freaking out on the bus, and he's like, "What? Is this your first alien invasion?" And it's like, this is a man who's seen some shit.
I like that part too.
I just loved how frank he was about it. Like, all these kids were freaking out, and it was just this, grizzled old bus driver. It's just like, yeah, no, this is a Tuesday for me.
It's like, this is small beans, kids. Small beans. Come on, we gotta go. Let's go. All right. Well, I think my favorite one was from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, when he's sitting there talking to the Watchers.
Oh, man. Anyway, before I was so rudely interrupted, at that time, I was a Federal Express man.
It's like he's telling stories about all these heroes, and all of a sudden, at the end of the movie, the Watchers just kind of go, and he's like, hey, don't leave me here. You're my ride. How am I going to get back home?
I was just about to bring that up, too.
Because I thought that was like the truest version of Stan Lee. I can imagine Stan Lee being in space just telling these stories.
He's in space jail.
Yeah.
In space jail. Just like Deckard Cain.
Right.
I'm Deckard Cain. Listen to my stories.
I think that would be awesome, though, if I ran to Stan Lee and space, and he's like I'm like, all right, yeah, I'll listen. Okay, yeah. Listen, all right, I gotta go now, so you take it easy. Like, I need to get home.
Great cameos.
Yeah. So, I mean, are there any final words on Stan Lee before we end off?
I just want to take a moment to thank Stan Lee for giving us a world that we can immerse ourselves in that has a sense of reality that's not as ugly as reality.
Okay. How about you, Andy?
It just goes back to his Hero Man work and what I said there. Just always ask questions, push buttons, find things out, experiment. Never grow complacent with anything, because you can't grow if you're not challenged.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to end off on a quote that Stan Lee gave in an interview. It goes, my theory about why people like superheroes is that when we're kids, we love to read fairy tales. Fairy tales are all about things bigger than life. Giants, witches, trolls, dinosaurs, and dragons, and all sorts of imaginative things. Then you get a little bit older, and you stop reading fairy tales, but you don't ever outgrow your love of them. End quote. I believe Stan Lee gave us stories that were bigger than him, and he knew it. And he gave us stories and characters that will always be with us. Thank you for watching Laketoria Nights. Rest in peace, Stan Lee.